Welcome back to Switched to Linux. Well, after we did our video last week looking at Ubuntu Cinnamon versus Linux Mint based on Ubuntu, some people asked, what's really the difference between Linux Mint and Linux Mint Debian Edition? And as you can guess, the simple answer is Debian. Well, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this video from Switched Linux. Of course, we're not done talking about it. But today we're going to have a brief comparative look at Linux Mint versus Linux Mint Debian Edition. And in fact, I went online to see what type of information we can find about it. And what I found is my video on the subject, which is a little outdated, being that it's from 2019. So I did this, of course, still sporting the old Linux Mint logo there. That will differentiate the video we have here based on the new logos. When we actually look it up, the first couple things we have are, this is my video from December 2019. So it's about, 2-3 years old by now. But then I actually found a couple of other things, just some things from the Linux Mint forums and people asking, this is from 2020, what really is the difference between all these guys? And people go in and say, a lot of the differences, the core of Linux Mint based on Ubuntu, everything is going to be the same. The difference you're going to have between the Linux Mint Cinnamon, the Mate, and the XFCE is going to be that it's going to be a different desktop environment, which means you have slightly different settings for your basic system utilities that are not specifically managed by Linux Mint. So, of course, the settings are generally, the settings itself is managed by Cinnamon. The update manager, the software store, those are all Linux Mint tools. So those are all going to be the same. Your settings panel is going to be different based on your desktop environment. Of course, Linux Mint Debian Edition is its own distribution based on Debian with the Cinnamon desktop. And so, of course, the Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition and the Linux Mint Debian Edition are going to be very similar in that they're both going to be distributions with the Cinnamon desktop environment. And remember that desktop environment is really that thing that is the in-your-face GUI about what you see. So as you're comparing these distributions, you have to understand that the things that we look at generally is more reliant on what the the desktop is rather than what the underlying Linux system is, the GNU Linux, as it were. Now, there was a good question asked over here in September of 2022 about the security differences. Is one of these more secure or less secure? The TLDR of this post here is that they're going to be equally secure. Why? Because Debian doesn't hold back security patches. That's the reputation of Debian. It just doesn't have as many updates. Well, the reason it doesn't have a lot of updates is there's really not a ton of security things. Why a lot of other systems change all the time, like Arch has an update every 3 hours, and why Ubuntu has updates nearly every single day, is because they're tweaking little features. They're doing little stuff. They're not messing with the security bugs. They're doing little tweaks and little twists and things like that. Some people love that. Some people hate that. That's going to be your own personal preference. So that really is your core difference. Debian doesn't do tweaks. That's why it's used for the space station. They don't want to be like, hey, let's move the UI bar over here and see how that works. No, we don't want that to happen when you're flying above the atmosphere thousands of miles from home because you're you're closer to the moon than you are to the Earth. Okay, I'm making that up, of course. I know kind of how this stuff works. But the point is that Debian is based on rock solid stability. They are not pushing out a lot of feature changes. They're not tweaking a lot of things. Once it's out, and it's a good solid distribution for a long time. The only updates you're going to get are going to be the security backports. So there is a separate thing when you're doing a distribution. There's a series of different repository sources. You go in a terminal and you do a sudo apt update on an Ubuntu or a Debian system, you're going to see it ping across all of those different repositories. Some of those are your core OS. Some of those are your security chains. Some of those are going to be your desktop environment, depending on your distribution. Some of them are going to be Ubuntu-specific things, stuff like that. And as you are pinging these, you're going to have these differences in that the Debian edition is going to ping off of those Debian security patches and the Debian repositories. Whereas Ubuntu is going to do the same thing off of the Ubuntu. This is why when you go into a Linux Mint distribution and you change those software repository sources, like your update manager asks you to do from time to time, you'll see one for Linux Mint and you'll see one for Ubuntu. The Ubuntu one's bringing in the underlying packages. The Linux Mint is bringing in the packages that override and supersede the Ubuntu ones, and also those will carry with it the desktop environment, things like that, because Linux Mint maintains those separately from your main distribution. So your overall ultimate difference, your security, it doesn't really make a difference which one of these you are on. And so what we're going to do here is I'm going to do a quick comparative, and something I don't remember if I did, pardon me, I didn't watch my video from like 2 years ago. But I don't think I went through their installers. Their installers are different. Linux Mint using the installer from Ubuntu. Of course, the new Ubuntu does have a new installer that just rolled out. That's not yet in the Linux Mint. And the Debian has a different installer. I'm going to walk through both of those. So we're going to do that, and then we'll go ahead and boot into each of the desktops and see. Now, for this case here, fair criticism on the last video I didn't push all of the updates for bandwidth issues. Today I said, I'm not going to worry about that. We're going to push all of those updates. So each one of the systems has been installed and fully updated today. So I will tell you this in full disclosure, the Linux Mint Debian edition broke something on the update. It wasn't hard to fix. There was one package that the new Cinnamon wanted that was conflicting with an old one, and it didn't install. And so what happened is when I rebooted the system, Cinnamon never showed up to play. Interesting. And that was simply fixed by getting into a terminal and reinstalling the package that failed the first time, and then reinstalling Cinnamon, and then everything worked. So as far as your solid stability, I'm going to give an instant tick mark to Linux Mint Ubuntu Edition because it's never blown up on me in that way. Although I did the video not too long ago where an update did bork it up, that didn't have as much to do with the software fouling up as the fact that the drive had too many kernel headers in it. So I don't know where that sits. Although maybe part of it is that Linux Mint wasn't clearing those out enough and auto remove wasn't doing the job. And we'll see if taking that box in the update manager solved the problem. I'll point you towards that video so you can see that. With that, let's go ahead and look at the installers, and then we're going to go ahead and boot into the distros themselves. So booting into the Linux Mint ISO here, this is the Linux Mint Ubuntu version. We have the compatibility mode, which is going to give us a little bit more like NVIDIA drivers, things like that. We have an OEM install, so if you're going to be installing a computer and giving it to somebody, use this because it installs all the components, and on first boot you do your user accounts and whatever else. So when you log into our main Linux Mint here, what we're going to see is it's going to boot us up, and we have the traditional Ubuntu installer. So on our basic Ubuntu installer here, we're going to go ahead and boot this guy up. And then you're going to see it's your standard Ubuntu installer that we've seen for a while. Now, as of note, the very latest release of Ubuntu, the 2304, actually has a new installer. So this is not the new Ubuntu installer on the new Ubuntu. This is the old Ubuntu installer. Very easy, very simple. That has just enough options, but not an overwhelming amount. We can install our media codecs here. And on the next step, we can erase the disk. We can do something else. And with the advanced features, we can do LVM, and we can use ZFS, or we can encrypt the new Linux Mint installation. So if you want to encrypt your whole disk, we have those options right here. So when you push the install now we're going to go through and it starts wiping everything out, and then it's going to walk through the creation of the system here. So let's just say we'll just do Mint. It's going to autofill a computer name. We can change it if we want, and then you can give it your password, and it doesn't throw a hissy fit if you're using a short password or not. We can log in automatically. We can also encrypt our home folder. So we can encrypt our home folder in addition to encrypting the whole disk. Once we click on next, it's going to start copying the files, and that gets us to the final installation procedure. All right, so here on the LMDE 5, we still have the basic, we have the compatibility mode, we have an integrity check, hardware detection, boot from your local drive, memory test. So we don't have an OEM install option. We're just going to go ahead and start in here. And once we get this guy started up, then we'll have a look at its installer, which is quite a bit different. All right, so now we'll go ahead and run our installer. You will notice here that we do have a different version of Cinnamon just on this. This is because of LMDE 5 is older. Once you actually install it and push the updates, it's going to get the latest version. So here's the installer. You can see it's a little bit different. We start with our language. We select our time zone that we're in, our keyboard, and then now we have to give it our information. So you do actually have to fill in the computer name. It doesn't autofill. Again, you can do whatever you want here. You can encrypt your home folder or not. You can log in automatically or not. Now, we also have some extra options here. If there's multiple disks, you can choose which disk rather than just assuming it goes on SDA, which is one of the downsides of Ubuntu. We can't direct it to install on a different disk if we have multiple disks. But we can still encrypt the system. But we really only have ext4 options. It does not appear as though we have the options for ZFS. So if that's important, that's going to be something that you have. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. It just means it's a different form of file system. Linux traditionally for a long time ran ext4, and some new ones like ButterFS and ZFS and other newer ones have been coming up, which it basically is how the disk is configured and how the files are stored. And some of them are better for preventing files from becoming deleted or things like that. So with that, though, you don't have to worry about it quite so much if you're new to Linux. Just go with the basic defaults. You're probably going to get an ext4 on a lot of systems. Some things are going ButterFS or ZFS by default now. It doesn't really make a lot of difference for the basic user which direction you're going. Just be aware that those differences occur. Here we can choose to install Grub or not install it at all. That's another option that we have in this installer that we don't have in Ubuntu. And you can choose specifically where it goes. If you do not know what all this means, keep it the default because it's going to work. So here is a summarization of what we have: our language, our time zone, our keyboard layout, our user settings, and our file systems. And then once we go through here, now we are in the exact same spot we were on the previous install system. So everything from here is going to be the same. All right, so we're going to start with the Linux Mint based on Ubuntu. I'm going to refer to this one as Linux Mint, and the Debian edition is going to be referred to as Linux Mint Debian edition or LMDE. So when we first land here on the desktop, and again, this is fully up to date, we have landed on the desktop, and I've done nothing to this except installed it and ran the updates. I don't think I changed anything else. It's the same one I used for the other build. You can see down here that updates, all the system is up to date, and we'll have a brief look at our Linux kernels here. And what we see on our Linux kernels is that we are running 5.15, and we can easily add up to 5.19 if we want to. Yes, it is possible to add kernels above that, but that gets into a little bit more of a complicated process, so we're not going to worry about that. The setting I alluded to earlier is that there is an automation setting in here that will automatically remove obsolete kernels and dependencies. This is unchecked by default, and I think that this is why that laptop, having such a small SSD in it, it ran out of space in the boot sector for these, and that's what caused the system to crash. So it wasn't the operating system as much as it was the kernel headers. So but the auto remove, which should take care of that, wasn't working for whatever reason, so I enabled that. That's okay. So everything inside of here is going to be just fine. And the first thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and have a brief look at the system information. So we'll do our system info here. And looking at our system info, we have Linux Mint 21.1. We have our Cinnamon version 568, Linux kernel version 515. And everything down here should be pretty much identical between the two because we're using the same system, and it should all be the same settings on it. We have an AMD Ryzen 5 1600. I've given this 4 processing cores. I've given it 4 gigabytes. Oh, I thought I gave them 6 gigabytes. Oh, well, I gave it 4 gigabytes, I guess. So there is what we have. Now, as far as your basic software installed, I believe they're going to be very, very similar. So, of course, some of the software is Ubuntu, or excuse me, is Linux Mint specific. All of the Linux Mint specific software, these are going to be things like your Warpinator. They're going to be the H word that I can't talk about anymore because for some reason the Tubies gives community strikes for talking about it, at least on my channel because I'm apparently evil. If you look at the USB image stick writers and formatters, those come with Linux Mint. Those are all going to be effectively the same. Of course, Linux Mint also packages its own Firefox browser. Now, LMDE used to have Firefox ESR, and I do not know what it has in the current version. So we're going to see that when we first start up. But we'll go ahead and hit our Alt there and just have a brief look. Our Firefox is the Mint 01, which is based on Firefox 112. You can see it's forcing all this crap on us. That means it's the version that sucks, but it's okay. Well, I'll plug my nose and use this Firefox because the alternatives are worse. So, with that, we also have over here the full LibreOffice suite. We have the databasing, which is useful for me because I actually use it. We have our Impress, our Math, our Libre Writer. We have the Rhythmbox Celluloid, the H word. We have our I think this one's also now packaged by Linux Mint as well. The web apps is basically based on the ICE applications. It gives us the ability to create single applications, single shell applications in isolated containers for web applications. So if you wanted to run YouTube specifically in one specific browser, you could go ahead and create the system over here, give it your name, give it the use, and then you have the option to either download an icon from this, or you can tell it to use the favicon of the site. So you have that as an option as well, and you can decide where it goes, what browser it's based on. Of course, you have to have more than Firefox installed. I believe Firefox, Chromium, Vivaldi, those are going to be options, and there's a few other options in there as well. So that's what we have inside of here. Now, I don't know why, but the new Linux Mint is removing desktop icons. This is something they've done in the latest version of Cinnamon. I disagree with that approach, but that's okay. We can right-click, view our desktop layouts, and then go into your desktop, and you can turn these guys on. I like keeping the mounted. I keep these days the home and the trash mounted on there. I don't find the other ones. Network sometimes, but usually if I need the network, I just go into home and find the network over here is usually what I do. Of course, this is sporting these new icons. I sort of liked these, but I understand why people didn't. And I do agree that if you really want the coloration of your system to be like, green or blue or whatever they're doing, then it does make more sense. Of course, if we're throwing in slight changes to the tweaks, bring back the green as the default. Just give us the blue as the option. So, of course, in the next version of Cinnamon, we are going to see more edits and more changes in the theming systems. And I have that whole video talked about that. We're going to get another tab here. Basically, all this current stuff with all of these options is going into an advanced window here. So you can do all this on the advanced window, but the newer system, basically what that's going to look like is what we currently have in the welcome screen under our first steps and choosing your light theme, dark theme, and your color accent. This is going to be one global setting under the themes. So this is not going to be dependent on Linux Mint to use. It's going to be involved in every version of Cinnamon. So looking at the first steps, we have the panel layout with the system snapshots. Your major difference between them is going to be this driver manager. This is an Ubuntu specific tool. What this is going to do is it's going to be looking for drivers your computer has that are not in the Linux kernel or not otherwise installed. So in this case, when it's done doing its search, it's going to tell me something about virtual machines, most likely. Okay, so it looks like it installed all the virtual machine stuff out of the box. That is, by the way, something Linux Mint Debian Edition doesn't do. But your one major difference, your one major change is going to be this driver manager. And this is something Linux Mint team said it is working on. So in Ubuntu, the driver manager allows you to launch this, detect your system, and install drivers for any other general component that's not otherwise available in the either in the Ubuntu repositories or in the kernel, which is going to give you a little bit better support on more obscure hardware. That is one of your key functions that this is going to have that LMDE is not going to have. Pretty much the rest of it is going to be the same. So here's our system settings, and you can see in our system settings, this is where our driver manager is. Here's our software sources, and what I was mentioning earlier is we have our main and our base. So this is going to be our Ubuntu, this is going to be our Linux Mint, and then you can sort where these are at. Of course, any other repositories are over here. These are things that you might want to mess around with on your own, but your security updates are going to come from these two channels, and that is what is always going to be updated very quickly. Everything else in here is going to look pretty much the same. If you were to give a brand new user LMDE versus Linux Mint, most people are not going to be able to tell what the difference is. So this is Linux Mint. Now we're going to have a look at LMDE. All right, so here we have landed on our desktop for LMDE. And so over here, what we can see is looking at our first steps, it's going to look effectively the same. Now, there's one thing in here that's not in here right now because I've already pushed the button, and that is multimedia codecs. So if you remember the Ubuntu version of Linux Mint, you have the option to install multimedia codecs on install. Debian does not allow that as an option because it's not considered free software. So there is an option inside of the welcome screen on first boot that allows you to install that. And if you just push launch, and once you've done it, it will disappear, so it's not there. It used to be, I'm not sure if it still is, but it used to be inside of your menu as well. But I think that they took it out of the menu just in favor of putting it in the welcome screen. All right. You'll also see down here we are completely up to date, but we don't have here our kernels. So we can't easily change our kernel in this one. Again, it is possible. And I actually did a video on it at one point in time a long time ago. In fact, I believe it was Linux Mint Debian Edition with the latest kernel with GNOME installed, if I remember the video correctly. That was a long time ago. But you can see that we do not have the easy option in there to change the kernel in LMDE. So that's going to be one of your overall changes we're going to see. Pulling up our system info, you'll see our operating system is now LMDE 5. We do have the same Cinnamon version, 5.6.8. We do have the Linux kernel 5.10 instead of 5.15. Older Linux kernel, that's really only going to be a problem if you're running the latest hardware. For example, my laptop, which has the Ryzen processor, also has an integrated graphics that is not even in 5.15. That's why I run a newer kernel at 5.19 on the laptop, because it supports the video way better than this does out of the box. And so that's one of the things to keep in mind, is if you're running the latest or newer cutting edge hardware, LMDE is going to be a harder run for you. As we'd already mentioned inside of our system settings, there is no driver manager down here, so installing extra drivers is going to be a little bit more complicated. Not impossible, not even particularly difficult, just going to be different. And here we have all the same theme settings here, and these are going to be the same as Linux Mint based on whatever version of Cinnamon that we have. Again, it didn't keep our didn't go ahead and keep our desktop. I put the wrong button there. thinking and talking at the same time. I don't do well with that. All right, so over here, let's go ahead and put our home and our trash back on there for the same consistent results. So now we basically have the same overall settings we had. We do still have all of the same tools that we had. So there's our Warpinator, there's our H word that I can't say on the tubies, and we have our USB image writer, stick formatter, all the tools that come with basic Linux Mint applications. They're all here because it's all the same thing. Really, your only underlying difference is the fact that we are running this based on Debian instead of being based on Ubuntu. Now, as far as if you're more familiar with how it works out, look at this. We are not running ESR. We are running the crappy version of Firefox. Maybe I should just install Debian just to be done with this crappy version of Firefox until it catches up to ESR. But you can see it is the same exact modified Firefox. They've put the same one into LMDE as they've put into Linux Mint. There we have that. So overall, though, if you do want to know really the difference here, and let's go ahead and have a brief look at, if I can remember exactly where they are, I believe it is Nano. I think it's Nano Source. Nope, not that one. Nope, that's the directory. My apologies. It's been a while since I've come in here and looked at this. And let's go into the sources and let's do a look at that package there. So what we see here is that we have enabled our main bullseye, we have our main, and then we have our contributor and our non-free. So it's not pure Debian, it's Debian with the non-free and the contributor repositories also enabled. So what that means in terms of Debian is if you want the pure Debian approach, then you use just the bullseye and the main after each of these lines. You get rid of the contrib and the non-free. And then what that's going to do is make sure that your Debian is running exclusively free software. This adds that bridge halfway in between Ubuntu and Debian, where it will have some non-free systems. Of course, everything is still audited and whatnot. There's nothing in here that's deeply proprietary. Nobody knows what it is, but it is code that is considered not free. Like multimedia codecs, you can install them, but there's questions about when and where. So that's what we have inside of LMDE. You can see overall it is going to be very similar. Your packages for the most part are going to be similar versions, if not the same. Of course, Firefox is always going to be the exact same. We didn't check. I probably should have checked out what Thunderbird is looking at. The LibreOffice version should be very similar because those tend to roll out through Debian pretty quickly as well. Those will update themselves. You're not going to see those getting old. So overall, LMDE is going to be a really good choice if you do not have the absolute latest cutting edge. If you want to be a little bit more on the more free end of things, it's going to be a little bit better option. So overall, what is our assessment? Both Linux Mint and LMDE are excellent choices for distributions. Overall, they're going to be very similar. All of the Linux Mint type components are going to be effectively the same. Your major difference is A, you have an older kernel in LMDE. B, you don't have the easy ability to adjust that kernel in the GUI tools provided by Linux Mint. And C, you do not have the driver manager, which is shipped with Ubuntu. Now, Linux Mint team has said they are working on something to replace that driver manager, and that might be one of those few things that they need to completely break free from the Ubuntu core. Overall, if you're not running a latest cutting edge piece of hardware, LMDE might be your better choice. I'm going to caveat might, because even when I rebooted this VM in order to run this portion of LMDE, it did foul up and not give me Cinnamon again. That could be because we're running this in a virtual machine. We had to install the guest editions, and there were a few other little contributing factors. Would that happen on real hardware? I don't know. I didn't actually look to see if other people were having that problems. In this case, I just went ahead, reinstalled Cinnamon, rebooted the system. Maybe it's just something wrong with my VM. Maybe it's something wrong with VirtualBox. Maybe I should try running it in GNOME boxes and see if it runs better over there. I don't know, but for whatever reason, 2 times today, I had an issue where Cinnamon did not show up to play on Linux Mint. And that's kind of a problem. That, of course, all dealt with the LMDE. If you're talking about security, as we've already addressed earlier in this video, the security is going to be about the same on all of them. So it doesn't really matter which one you might want to use. And so overall, what I'm going to suggest is it doesn't really matter which one of these you're going to use. You should use the one that you like the most. And overall, that is what my overall choice would be. Now, I'm still using the Linux Mint based on Ubuntu in the current build that I'm having. But I am going to tell you this out of the box that I have actually said in the past, and I'm going to stick myself to it, provided I remember, of course, that the next time I need to rebuild my system or reinstall the operating system itself, then I'm probably going to go with LMDE. And as long as I don't have any major bugs on LMDE, I'm dropping the Ubuntu version in favor of LMDE. And I do not see a reason why that would be a problem. So there is my final take. We'll just kind of wrap this video up briefly. We do have a channel sponsor. I think this would be a good time to mention them just because I think this video will be a little bit bigger, get a little bit more of that. But MALIBAL Computers has agreed to sponsor the channel for a couple of months. So I'll point you back to their site, tlm.li/MALIBAL. And these guys here will have high-end custom Linux laptops, and you can they've actually added a few more distros you can choose from as well. So if you go down and click on a customize button, you actually have your choice right now of Ubuntu, Kubuntu, Ubuntu Cinnamon, Vanilla, Linux Mint, or a couple of Windows options. So those are some of the choices that you have. So check them out, tlm.li/MALIBAL. Link will be in the description. With that, thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux. Thank you for watching this video from Switched to Linux. This channel would not be possible without the backing of the program supporters scrolling on the screen now. You can be a supporter at Patreon at patreon.com/TOMM or at thinklifemedia.com. I also want to thank the open source community who creates such excellent software that makes producing this show possible. Please remember to support your software communities. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.